If you had to do a thumbnail sketch of what Herb Caen is really like, how would you describe yourself?
Well, he's a phony, for one thing. Overdressed, overpaid, malaprop artist has been getting away with murder for years. And someday they're going to catch up with me.
I'm not aware of any other writer who their entire career was simply focused on reporting and writing about one place on the earth in that much depth as long as Herb Caen did.
We don't have anything that can even remotely compare to a Herb Caen. That kind of column just really doesn't exist anymore, where people wake up in the morning to see if they're going to be in Herb Caen or to see if they did something good in Herb Caen, or more probably, if they got busted doing something they shouldn't have been doing, it would be in the first paragraph.
It was a masterpiece what he accomplished through that column. It had a rhythm to it every single day. You would get on the train at the beginning of the column and you couldn't get off until he was finished.
There'd be cops and bookies, diplomats, Nobel laureates, movie stars, panhandlers. Anybody could get in Herb Caen's column if they had a good item, if it read. And his joy and burden was to fill this column every day. It became kind of a monolith. He created this thing, this column, and for 50 years he had to fill it.
He's the lead purveyor of metaphor. He's the lead of this daily, inexhaustible San Francisco magazine that each day arrives on the doorsteps of all San Franciscans, of all Bay Area, announcing simultaneously that San Francisco is the greatest place in the world. You're lucky to live here, and here's the wonderful things that are happening now.
People of influence came to San Francisco, read Herb Caen, went home to whether it was Chicago or New York or Dubuque or anywhere, and they communicated something of what they read in Herb's column.
The view of the city is kind of Herb Caen's view of the city. That's still around. That you're supposed to behave in a certain way, you're supposed to act in a certain way, to look at us, that he reflected that.
I could take Herb Caen anywhere, any Jordanist town, black, white, or otherwise, and Herb Caen would be right at home.
When people ask you why Herb was so unique and meant so much to the city, the simplest way for me, my answer always is, Herb gave the city a heartbeat.
Herb Caen was a unique newspaperman. He was not only like the hardest working, sidewalk pounding, three-dot journalist who covered the daily events of the city and served them up every morning for everyone in town read him. So he was basically the world's greatest gossip columnist. That was really his gig, and he, in many ways, didn't pretend to be any more than that. But on top of that, what made Herb Caen so special, and I don't think there's ever been another American newspaperman like this, was that he combined that with this remarkable ability to write in a deeply literary and lyrical way about the city, so that he brought together this kind of, chicken scratches of daily minutia of life, and very witty and funny. And incredibly sourced. Again, this guy knew everybody in town, from the lowliest, poorest people, from taxi drivers, from hookers, from hobos, homeless people, to the most powerful people in town who he hobnobbed with. And he brought all of that information together in a way that nobody else did, or ever has done since then. But in addition to that, he would write these set pieces on Sundays especially, but he also wrote a number of books, which basically were these lyrical pieces. And they were gorgeous. They sometimes were a little treacly, and they could, the fog drifting in, and this, but he had a real edge. He was he was a gifted writer, and he took it very seriously. And this brings up, another amazing facet of this guy that is basically just, it's corny, but it has to be said. Everything was driven with him by his incredible love of San Francisco. So he became, and he was called Mr. San Francisco, and he really it became far more than anyone else you could think of. Almost like he was San Francisco. And he was from Sacramento. And I think he brought to San Francisco this feeling of a provincial, that this was this big, glamorous, sophisticated city, and it always was something enticing and glamorous and sexy and glowing for him, and that quality of marvel, and he called it Baghdad by the Bay, as if it was sort of this fairy tale out of the Arabian Nights, and that quality he never lost over close to a 60-year career, which is astonishing in itself. To basically be a daily columnist for close to 60 years and still preserve this sense of wonder and a great sense of humor about the town. Here in the library, they have this fantastic collection of all of his columns in these big, enormous folders. Each one of these notebooks, these spiral notebooks, which are in a big, huge box, each one is 1 year. And there's like dozens of these boxes, and just the experience of leafing through these things is kind of overwhelming. The physical output of Herb Caen, writing 16,800 word columns. It's like millions of words. It's this extraordinary output. It's an output that is, I think, bigger than Balzac's. It's just this oeuvre. And it's a testament. It's a legacy of hard work and of extraordinarily high quality. Because sure, a lot of this, as I say, world's greatest gossip columnist, well, that in itself is no mean feat. I mean, being a really good gossip columnist is a significant achievement. But then when you add in the other elements that go into these millions of words that he produced, 6 days a week, it's kind of overwhelming. I think really an emblematic thing that really demonstrates exactly who Herb Caen was that his first wife, when she sued him for divorce, and he was married many times, usually to very young and beautiful women, his first wife actually cited the city of San Francisco as a co-respondent in the divorce case, as if, this was his mistress, the city. And it's absolutely perfect, because you could look at Herb Caen, he got married a whole bunch of times. San Francisco was the one lady that he never left. He contained multitudes in a way, and that was one of the things that just kept people fascinated with his column, was not only, oh gee, what's the gossip, what's going to happen, what absurd thing, but also a sense that you're going to learn about, this guy's going to somehow present to you the entire city as if it's something that can be squeezed into one entity and that you can get your arms around. And so it's almost like the idea of a city-state. Like San Francisco was not just a city, this was a little universe. And he perceived it and he portrayed it that way. And that's an extraordinary achievement.
When I was a boy, we had 4 newspapers in town, 2 morning papers, 2 evening papers. Everyone read those newspapers. It was the way to stay in touch with your life in San Francisco. The papers were the Chronicle and the Examiner, the morning papers. The afternoon papers were the Call Bulletin and the News. So you got people buying those afternoon papers and then taking the streetcar home, stopping at a saloon somewhere along the way and having the newspaper. The morning newspaper you either got on your way to work or you had it delivered at home. But everybody read those newspapers. And that is the point at which Herb Caen came in. Caen, as you know, was from Sacramento, and he worked up there as a newspaper guy.
One thing to realize about Herb Caen is that he grew up with this mythic notion of newspapers, mythic notion of being a journalist, mythic notion of living in a big city like San Francisco, writing for the big paper.
A wonderful man named Paul C. Smith, who was the editor of the Chronicle, brought Herb Caen to San Francisco.
Paul Smith was then known in the world of journalism as the Wonder Boy, editor and general manager of the Chronicle at the age of, I think, 29 or something like that. And he really came on as a dynamic young guy, and he had this future. The Chronicle was going to be the New York Times of the West, and we were going to have bureaus all over the country, and we were going to have bureaus in Europe.
Smith brought Herb Caen to San Francisco, and he brought him as a radio columnist, because in those days, as I said, there were newspapers. That's what you did. You read the newspaper, but of course you also listened to the radio.
So Herb Caen comes to the Chronicle. He's the radio columnist taking place of Dinty Doyle. The sum total of the apprenticeship is Doyle telling him, you gotta be seen around town. You gotta go around town. You gotta be seen. People care about reading something from the guy they see around town. It's not just the words on the page, it's the larger sense of the public image. Herb Caen was probably like a lot of journalists who came of age in the 30s. He wanted to be Walter Winchell. Winchell is this incredible items columnist who made up the notion of items. He's out on Broadway every night. He's running around New York. He's breaking news left and right. He's titillating you. He's, kind of dropping the veil behind power. He's doing all these things. What ambitious young journalist doesn't want something like that? And Caen really wrote a lot and talked a lot about how he was doing columns like that in his high school paper, doing items columns. He gets hired in Sacramento, he gets hired at the Chronicle. He just kept doing the thing he wanted to do. The San Francisco Chronicle in the late 1930s was not the only newspaper in America that thought, well, maybe we could have an items column. I mean, that was pretty commonplace. So when Caen suggested, why don't I do a Walter Winchell column here in San Francisco, the editors are like, well, sure, give it a shot. It'll work or it won't. I mean, he was doing the radio column, but at the time, newspapers were deciding radio was a threat to newspapers, so it was cutting back on radio columns. So it's almost like he had a spare body around.
Herb Caen used to say, item, item, give me an item. Who's got an item? Okay, what is an item? Well, an item actually can be many things, because in his wanderings, Caen would hear little stories about people, jokes, puns, bad puns, good puns. And he heard all these things as little short stories. And he would then put these little short stories, after making notes of them, he would put them in what he called his item smasher. His item smasher. They would go in the item smasher. When he was writing his column, he would go into this box and he'd dig out a little short story. And he'd sit at the old Royal typewriter, put 3 dots in, and then he would create an item. An item was probably no longer than 20 or 25 words.
A 3-dot column was almost the Twitter of the day. The idea was to keep moving fast, and don't let people get bored. The idea wasn't to do 4 items a day and kind of build them and transition and be clever. The idea was to just keep shooting things out. So it's like a stream of information. Again, it's like Twitter. You check your Twitter feed, and even as you're checking it, 3 more things are coming up. I mean, Caen made no secret of the fact that he was just aping Winchell. If anything, he slowed down the pace a little bit. And he also made no secret of the fact that he was trying to hit as many different places as possible. So you just keep peppering people with items.
Herb loved North Beach. He spent a lot of time in North Beach, and he wandered around here. And he had many favorite places that he liked to go in North Beach. Herb Caen used to like to hang out here in Gino and Carlo. He loved it because the people here were real people. The people that you see at the bar here today are the descendants of the people that Caen used to write about when he would come in. He would come in and search for what he called items, and he found items in Gino and Carlo.
My name's Jesse Hamlin. I was Herb Caen's assistant, his leg man, in an archaic newspaper term that he loved. I was his assistant from 79 to 85. And he had one assistant. There was a woman who typed his letters. We used to call them secretaries. But it was just Herb and me. And I was in a tradition, goes back to a guy named Jerry Bunsen, who was his first leg man in the 30s. Jerry was a flack publicist who had been Benny Goodman's publicist. And Herb was a huge Benny Goodman fan, and that's how they met. And when Herb started writing a daily general column, he hired Jerry to come in and work for him. And Jerry was an amazing hustler who knew a million people and great at picking up items. That's what it was all about, little nuggets of information, nothing long. Again, it was this jumble of stuff, but it had to be entertaining. And his great gift was making it swing, tying it all together, which he did on the fly like a great jazz player, improvising on the changes. He'd written all these stories before, but he'd lay them all out. We'd type up items on perforated sheets of copy paper, cheap brown paper, which would come in thin rolls, which he would roll into his Royal Manual, and I used the same. You'd gather something you heard or something, and we got lots of mail, 1,000 letters a week, phone rang every 5 minutes, so you'd be constantly gathering all this information and trying to make sense of it. And after a while, you developed an ear for what a Herb Caen item was, which hundreds of thousands of other people did too. And it was very common for people to say, oh, that's a Caen item, I have to send that to Caen. And that's where a lot of material came from, the readers.
Well, I met Herb Caen in 1982. That's when he first wrote his first story about me. I had Joe Montana had just thrown the Dwight Clark for the catch, which got to the first Super Bowl against the Bengals. And then a couple days later, I was working outside the Sir Francis Drake Hotel, and I ran down Powell Street and I tackled two robbers that robbed some tourists at a hotel. So Herb Caen wrote about as Tom Sweeney, the Beaker Dorman, Sir Francis Drake, and Joe Montana and Dwight Clark were getting honored for the highest bravery award. Herb Caen wrote it, he said, Mayor Feinstein's going to honor a quarterback receiving a tackle. From then on, I became a contributor and writer to the Chronicle, and I appeared in there over 100 times. He picked up a lot of my stories, and they were all real funny, and I just learned what three-dot journalism was. The quick stories, I always call them quick sound bites. It's the stories that people remember. And if you made Herb Caen's column, you were the hit of the town. They remember you for years to come. I still have people to this day come up to me and remember me being in that column, which is amazing because he's passed away for several years. Yeah, it was so cool. Every Monday, Herb Caen, after he'd write his column, because he had to get the stories in by 11 o'clock every day, and every Monday he'd come by and see me afterwards, and we'd talk up through what's going around the city. And he'd check all the restaurants around here. When you read his column, you knew what's going on in San Francisco. And when he called me at home, I felt it was the President of the United States calling me. I mean, that's how powerful he was.
I moved to San Francisco in 1971, and one of the best things about it was that everybody read Herb Caen's column in the morning. And there were like 20 items or so, and very lively. He knew everybody, he knew everything. And there would be a topic, whatever was most interesting in his column, everybody that you met already knew about it and you could talk about it. And there isn't anything like that today. About a year later, I sent him a an envelope with no return address. And I said, I didn't believe in reincarnation in any of my other lives. I don't see why I should have to believe in it in this one. And he printed it. So I went to work, and everybody is, way to go, way to go. And friends called, and I liked it. So I sent him another one and another one. In 1980, he had printed about 100 of them. And I was writing a book called The Strange Experience, and so I wanted statistics. So I went downtown, dressed in a business suit with a clipboard, and just walked up to people and said, "Who is strange to Jim?" And it was somewhere between 85 and 90% knew, just immediately said, he's the guy from Herb Caen's column. So it's an amazing amount of fame. But I could go anywhere, no one noticed me, and I could walk up to anyone, anywhere, and say, "Hi, I'm strange." And they'd look at me funny and they say, "Strange to Jim?" And I say, "Yes." And I was sort of just the right amount of famous.
Being married to Herb was really such a joy. Actually, we were only married for 2 years, but we were together for 12 years. And we got along so well because we had common interests, so he didn't have to change for me, nor did I for him. So we got off on the right foot to begin with. So everything that we did, our travels, we always enjoyed the same things. So being married to him, a lot of people thought that he might have been very sharp and critical, but he wasn't. He was like a big pussycat, really, really sweet, and would, offer to clear the table and wash the dishes, and really just a great guy. So that was a big plus for me. And then we would go out every night because he really pictured himself as a working newspaper man, and he had to go out and get those stories. With the fax machine and all these new electronics, people didn't operate like that anymore, but he still thought there would be a story somewhere. So he would come home from the office and change his shirt, and off we would go. And we'd probably go to a new restaurant almost every time we went out. And of course, the restaurants wanted to offer to give us our meal and let us try this course and that course. And of course, he never, ever accepted a free meal, without a doubt, or hotel. He would politely say that my paper will not allow this, and so I can't accept a free meal. I must pay for it. So that he did. Now, we did always try to spend Friday night at home. So that was our night. We would play classical music. I would actually cook the dinner, and we would play games. Play either backgammon or dominoes or gin rummy. So we love games. In fact, when we first started going out, we went to a baseball game, and I said, "Could you get me a program?" And he said, "Okay, sure." And so I opened it up because I'm a scorekeeper. That I just proceeded and kept score, and I think that's what the thing that really shorted up. I think, he said, "You keep score?" Couldn't believe it. So we shared the baseball love. I've had many people walk over my toes, literally, to get to him. If we're at a party and I'm standing next to him, any number of times that has happened, they just go right across my toes. I had different papers that wanted to woo him from the Chronicle, talk to me, saying what they would give him if he would come over to their papers. So that was always very interesting. Well, Herb was never very interested in money. In fact, when I first met him, I found that he didn't even have an expense account. And I said, "What?" So being more of a math and money person, he changed that. But he just didn't care about money at all. It just didn't make any difference to him. And he was very, very loyal to the Chronicle family. And he felt like he was part of the family, and they felt he was part of the family. He was really orientated to going to Europe all the time, and he just loved it. So I was always in charge of planning trips. We would go to Paris for New Year's Eve for many years. Herb would use either this size book, that's when he was very serious, but when we traveled, he always had this in his hand, in his pocket, to jot down just little notes. I know when we traveled, for example, he would just put down 2 words and just to nudge his memory when he had to sit down to write about it.
The Baghdad by the Bay metaphor emerges in a number of writers in the late 1930s. Already with the 2 bridges complete, there's a sense where you get up and look at the fully completed city of San Francisco, with the fog coming in through the bridges and the bay and the foghorns blaring. You have a sense of magic of a city that's transformed. And in fact, San Francisco becomes, in the late 30s, early 40s, just before the war, the best symbol of itself. What's San Francisco about? It's about San Francisco. And then they would show you Fisherman's Wharf and these other places. Like Baghdad, an assembled, imaginative city.
Between 1936 and 1946, the city completely changed. The 2 bridges were built. World War II happened, huge jump in population, and more importantly, people from the other parts of the United States discovered San Francisco, which was then, somebody told me who came here during World War II, that, what's this place? This is like someplace in Europe. And how come I didn't know about this? What do you mean you didn't know about this? He thought New York was the center of the universe. It couldn't possibly be anything more interesting than New York. Maybe Chicago, it's the second city than this. So people came here and discovered it. And then doing that, they changed it.
How many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of men sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge, had drinks at the Mark Hopkins the night before, and told themselves, if I don't get killed, I'm moving back to San Francisco. The cultural heritage of people who discovered this area through World War II. I'm talking like Lawrence Ferlinghetti types, Larry Halpin, the landscape architect. These people, this is how they learned about it. So Caen, it's a little bit like today. Caen is a journalist in the front seat of this major cultural shift, which is suddenly California is the promised land. And so you really see, it's fascinating, you kind of 45 to 50, you see the items, but again, Caen was all about topicality. So the items are about nobody can afford a house, nobody can find a house. Traffic's messed up. What are we going to do in this city? And it wasn't like kind of I'm going to put on my serious hat. I think this is where he had learned as a journalist. You don't stop things and say, now I'm going to pontificate. It's part of daily life, it's part of the column. Anyone whose notion of Herb Caen is that the guy who gallivanted around town in the 80s and 90s was Herb Caen from the start, you just need to look at a book of his from 1948, the San Francisco book. It was intended, it taps into the whole, gee, all these people are moving to California, maybe they want to buy a book. So Houghton Mifflin decides to publish a book. Herb Caen gets hired, and it's a collection of words and photographs, terrific photographs. And then Caen, it's kind of a collection of columns, but it was reassembled with a care that you can show them. This is the kid who was dazzled to be at the San Francisco Chronicle. Now he's a kid who's dazzled to be doing a book for a major publisher. And it's fascinating because a lot of it is really talking about the dilemmas facing this city. Here's this city that loves the past. Here's this city that kind of loves the notion of it's a little village on hills and things like that. This city is also being flooded with new immigrants. Immigrants in the classic immigrant sense, so to speak, but people who want to buy houses and things like that. And so you read this, and a lot of it really, it resonates with the city of today, where it's wrestling with how do we do a city where people don't have housing, where the roads are jammed. He just kind of airily talks about we need another Bay Bridge at some point soon. That was not Caen just musing. That's what all the planners were talking about back then. And then you also catch this with the whole, how does the city accept and embrace the idea of large-scale change and new things? It's a fascinating book because, what we tend not to appreciate today when we look back at the changes in America in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, you look at it and you think these people were crazy. Why did they tear down neighborhoods? Why did they do this? Why did they do that? And you can find lots of motives and lots of not good motives. But also, this is a country that had just won World War II in less than 4 years. So the country had been kind of rewired to think, if there's a big problem, we can solve it. And so Herb Caen, he was very much part of the whole, hey, we just beat Germany, we just beat Japan, now we're going to beat blight, now we're going to beat poverty, now we're going to beat overcrowding.
The city has real problems, had real problems 30 years ago and 50 years ago and 20 years ago, and they still have real problems. And Caen understood that too, that there are. He didn't think that the people who lived in 3rd and Townsend were colorful. He thought they were pathetic, it was sad. 3rd and Townsend, it was Skid Row then, now it's high-class 50 hotels and stuff. But the poor, homeless people have moved around, but there are more now than there were in his time. And he saw them and saw who they were. The city didn't do anything about it, and he would be on them. Now I'm sure if Herb Caen were around and he had this gigantic homeless problem, he would be after City Hall all the time to think up something besides phony excuses for it. So he was in a lot of ways the conscience of the city too.
I think most people would be surprised that the vast majority of reporters' raw copy is not what appears in major publications. I mean, most people take a pretty good deal of editing. What's amazing about Herb's columns is you can't edit that story form very easily. I mean, you can't improve on it, you can't reword it. It's almost uneditable, which is how you know that it actually was written by an insanely talented journalist. I remember when one of our columnists was asked to become the exclusive columnist of San Francisco, and I was a very junior editor at the time, and he was really sweating this because he told me, he was like, well, the city editor wants me to write only about San Francisco. And I looked at him and there was horror in his face. And I said, they want you to be Herb Caen? And he's like, yeah. So I think there's a reverence and people say to me all the time, oh, what you need is another Herb Caen. And the truth is you can't have another Herb Caen. I mean, anyone can have a blog, anyone can tweet, anyone can do these things. To pull it all together and give it to an audience that knows it's getting a 150-year-old legacy of journalism. I mean, you can't create that on, a WordPress platform nowadays. So I'd like to think there might be somebody out there who's going to create the next 3-dot column, and we will find them, and they will work for the Chronicle.
I'm Barnaby Conrad III. I'm an author. My father was Barnaby Conrad Jr., was also an author, and he was Herb Caen's best friend for about 40 years. They met in the 30s. My father was a teenager. Herb was about 6 years older. So he was very much a part of our family, and I really thought him as an uncle. After World War II, all the GIs came back, and other people flocked to San Francisco, and there was a huge nightclub scene. It ran all up and down North Beach, Broadway, and my father opened a nightclub in 1952 called El Matador. Everyone went there for nightcaps, or you could have a simple dinner. But Herb was the first through the door. He chronicled everything that happened there. He was a night owl himself. He often ended up there late. He brought people in there. Truman Capote, William Saroyan, who's a friend. And so my father also brought people in, and they shared celebrities, frankly. They enjoyed celebrity. They loved talent. Herb loved music. And in fact, Herb played the drums very, very well. And he'd sometimes sit in and play with some of the musicians. The Matador was a special place. Sinatra went there, Danny Kaye went there, Orson Welles went there, Marilyn Monroe came in, a young Ronald Reagan came in once, a junior senator from Massachusetts came in, became a president later, and Eva Gabor came in. There were also people they tried to keep out too, like Tallulah Bankhead, who literally got up at a table drunk and dancing. And I said, were people trying to get her clothes off? And my father said, no, we were trying to keep her clothes on. For me, he had an element of jazz in his writing. And he was really like, he could dance through sentences like Fred Astaire. But he always had a little bebop aspect. But he could take a phrase, here's one I always loved, the car strangled Spanner. That's what he called the Bay Bridge. Nobody could do what he did. As I said, he really was the Fred Astaire of three-dot journalism. This is Broadway. This area, starting from the gold rush of 1849, was known as the Barbary Coast. It was filled with theaters, dance halls. This is the center of Bohemia in San Francisco. This is Enrico's Cafe, Enrico's Sidewalk Cafe, it was known as. Herb Caen ate here probably twice a week, if not more, for his whole life. It was owned by Enrico Banducci, who was a real character. He'd always play his violin during lunchtime. Herb would get a lot of his great items sitting right at that table there was known as the family table. It was actually just inside. And my father and Herb would be there, and people like John Steinbeck would join them. Herb was always there, and he was always looking for a scoop.
Herb wrote about everything, absolutely everything. But I have to admit, I went through high school and the last years of grammar school with my mother being down and out because Herb Caen said something today. So I grew up disliking Herb quite a bit because my mother was always upset and he didn't have the greatest things to say about Dad, just generally speaking. And so my father would always refer to him in public, to his face, as the Sacramento Kid, making it very clear that he's not from our city and county of San Francisco. And it would really annoy Herb. So it was pretty rough because he had a lot of comments about a lot of things that Dad did, including the pyramid building, including Yerba Buena, the Yerba Buena Center, the South of Market. There's nothing like a Herb Caen column in any newspaper in this nation. And you know, a lot of people would say that's great, like my mother would have. But a lot of people would say that kind of writing is non-existent, and it was fascinating. It kept readers enthralled, and it's something that I personally miss very, very much.
Here, it was so great because we were on the waterfront and we were in a very rough and tumble neighborhood at the time. And the one thing that was great about this business when we opened is that we had so much pedestrian traffic, but not nearly what we've got now. I mean, what we had then was, you know, kind of dribbles of pedestrians, but runners, mostly runners, curious about what was going on. And this was an old-time famous Dixieland jazz joint. And so when we came into the kitchen and started to build up the food business, Herb Caen was very much, you know, behind it because this was kind of a forgotten, wonderful waterfront area that we were lucky enough to be able to kind of revitalize. And I think that what made a big difference for us was his presence. Like, he would come here and enjoy what we were doing. He would sit at the table that was by the windows, on the wall, by the piano, and just, you know, enjoy what we had to offer and participate, which was great.
I worked for a woman named Marion Conrad, who was an old-fashioned PR woman. Every morning when we'd go in, Marion would get a call from Herb Caen, and he'd say, what do you got? And she'd say, well, so-and-so were off in the corner at a party. I think there might be a divorce, you know, just stuff like that. I don't think he ever tried to hurt people, but she'd give him the social scoop from her point of view. And then she would say to him, okay, I have Lawrence Halprin, who's the landscape architect, and he's doing all the landscaping at Sea Ranch, and I'd like to really get his name out. And so they'd trade information, you know, and I'd hear them do it, and I just thought, wow, it was old-fashioned moxie, you know. I thought that was kind of great.
Herb Caen approval comes to those San Franciscans who choose to be San Franciscans, who show up and reinvent themselves here. William Saroyan was a typical Herb Caen figure. He was from Fresno, but he had reinvented himself in San Francisco as a bohemian writer, and indeed became a bohemian writer. And The Time of Your Life, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, which he turned down, was set in a San Francisco waterfront bar. Everything about Bill Saroyan, his autodidacticism, his flamboyance, his love of the ponies, love of track and gambling, everything about him, Herb Caen loved. I mean, that was a good story, a good Herb Caen story. It also gave Herb a connection into the literary world, because Saroyan, although a distinctive, idiosyncratic kind of writer, is going to last. Again, Herb Caen likes Sally Stanford because she inhabits a genre, i.e. Madam. She's self-inventing. She chose her name was Spinoli. She chose the name Sally Stanford because Stanford beat Cal that day when she saw it in the newspaper, so she took that name. She's a product of self-invention, and then she reinvents herself as a politician, a restaurateur, and mayor of Sausalito. Perfect Herb Caen story, because he's writing constantly about people for whom San Francisco offers a second or third chance at reinvention.
Actually, at this point, I'm probably the guy in this town who is still moving, who knew Herb for longer than anybody else. Not that I knew him well, but he's one I really miss, because he always he was the most witty guy, and this town is not crammed with witty people. And not only was he witty, but he managed to get it all the way to print. And that has to be valued very highly. And along with that, he did something that I prize greatly. He managed to be very irreverent. And irreverence is something this town needs. I first knew him because I would be starving at the end of each month, and I had to be creative to get the rent together. And so I was feeding story ideas to magazines in New York. And they would say, well, San Francisco, what do you got out there? This was back in the 40s when the World War II was just over. So everything was shaken up. It was all a new ball game. And I'd say, well, you know, we got steep hills and fog and Chinatown and a couple of bridges that won't quit. And we got Herb Caen, of course. And they'd say, okay, do us a story. And so I'd call Herb and say, hey, you know, I'm trying to tidy up this story, so we got to go out and do it again. And he said, that's okay. The Fillmore at that time was a very risky area. Now it's all boutiques and wonderful, colorful restaurants. But at that time, it was the place of jazz clubs. Both Herb and I enjoyed the jazz clubs. Neither of us were attached to any ladies at that point. And it wasn't very painful to complete these stories. And so that was really the basis of my relationship with Herb. And I would see him in between at social events, or as one of his ex-wives said, well, Herb has to be somewhere every night. And so our paths would cross. And then I would occasionally, in cleaning out my files, find an old print had come back from some magazine or other, and I'd tuck them in the mail. And on one of our encounters, he said, Fredo, would you mind doing me a great favor? Don't send me any more pictures of me when I had hair. And indeed, his hair, when I first knew him, had been electric. As time went on, I got to witness this metamorphosis into a very, very handsome, authoritative-looking gentleman who was always impeccably turned out. And he did gather an incredible bunch of people around him. At one point, he moved from one paper to the other, and I talked to one of the people who'd replaced him on the last paper. And I said, so how is it? And he said, it's tough going. You know, this town only has so many talking lawyers and talking doctors, and Herb's got them all tied up. And it was true. There were columns that tried to compete with him, but he was unique. And I was always irritated at the prevalence of a lot of his admirers in the gossip level of newspaper at that point. And they would say, oh, Herb, you write so well. When are you going to write something serious? Well, that inflamed me because I recognized that essentially Herb was first and foremost a newspaper man, and he was very disciplined. He managed to turn out one column after another every day, and he managed to create something that wasn't always consistent, but there was always a payoff for reading his column. And everybody did.
Back in the day, the first thing you would pick up in the morning is the newspaper. And a lot of people would look for Herb Caen's column immediately because it was the most interesting thing in the newspaper to read about. And in the paper would be tidbits, gossip about what was going on in neighborhoods, what was going on in politics, what was going on in the arts. And it was great that he wrote about what was going on in Chinatown because it made Chinatown a part of what was going on in San Francisco. And that's a really important, very significant for the Chinese community. You know, Chinese have been in San Francisco since there was a San Francisco, but we've been a very small community, insular, for a number of reasons. And Herb Caen wrote everyday things about the Chinese communities, about how Chinese were living, about Chinese businessmen, Chinese people in industry. And so he humanized us. Chinatown is a very confined space, and so he would make those living conditions come alive. And that was important in conveying to the general public what the situation was for Chinese. And over time, from probably the late 50s through the 60s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the kind of all that activism, I think it helped to let people know that living conditions, quality of life for Chinese needed to be improved.
To me, he wasn't Herb Caen, he was Dad.
So for the first part of my life, it was just sort of these cool dad that I get to hang out with, and I get to meet famous people and hang out with them, and that's cool. And it wasn't until I got into 7th or 8th grade that I started realizing that it was sort of capital H, capital C, Herb Caen. And it was a little daunting. It was a little, there was definitely a shadow. And one of the things that I did was actually wound up going to high school in New Hampshire, 3,000 miles away, because I just wanted to kind of not be Herb Caen's son for a while. And not that it was a reflection on my relationship with my dad, but the weirdest thing about growing up in the city, being my dad's son, was this weird connection between me and my dad. So if people didn't like my dad, they immediately didn't like me. Or if they did like my dad, they loved me, even though they'd never met me. And I would often say, I'd rather someone hate me for who I am than like me for who my dad is. And so that was sort of a weird thing to manage. And then also just sort of you'd meet people, and they're super friendly. And you can't help after a while but wonder, are they being friendly because we're getting along, or are they friendly because they want to get to my dad? So it was a weird dynamic, and after a while I'm like, just going to go to high school somewhere else and kind of just unplug from that for a while. But it's also a ton of fun. I mean, I got to meet great people, and I got to sing funny songs with Clint Eastwood and Merv Griffin. I got to ask Jacques Cousteau questions. I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time at night with him, because he really did go out every single night. It was shocking. I mean, years later when I wrote a column for the Examiner, I'd go out 3 or 4 times a week and I'd be exhausted. It wasn't like it was forced upon him or it was a job. I mean, it was a love. I mean, I remember when he passed away and people said, well, if you think about following your dad's footsteps, well, there's no footsteps. It's not possible. Him and the column were of the same being. And it was just this, you get these certain artists and these certain vehicles where it's just this miraculous combination of forces that makes it happen. And no, I think he was very fulfilled and led just a mythological life and really did it. And yet, I think what made him stay relevant through all the decades that he wrote, and then changing decades, the 60s and the 70s, and then people think the city's changing now, but the city's always changing. And he had this ability to always stay relevant, always find the right nerve to touch at any time, and it was a pretty remarkable gift. The children's book was great. I was always fascinated with Chinatown. When you're a kid, Chinatown's just like fascinating. It's like going to another world. So it's not surprising that he would do something around that, because I always kind of talked about it with him like it was this fantasy kind of place. It's amazing. I still to this day have people come up to me and go, oh, I read my kid Cable Car and the Dragon when they were growing up, and it's really lived on. And it's funny, for all his books and all his columns that he wrote, it's the book that he's best known for.
Herb Caen liked this neighborhood. His depictions of the Tenderloin were just so stirring, so unique. No other writer of the period was capturing what Herb Caen captured. And so he's very special. We have a poster in the Tenderloin Museum that just opened, and it's also a T-shirt, which Herb Caen line, which says, "City that doesn't have a Tenderloin is not a city at all," because he understood. And he was before the Tenderloin became more difficult economically, even during its prosperous periods. It always had a gambling, prostitution kind of underground economy, which appealed to Herb Caen. He liked the kind of roughness of it. He was never excited by the gleaming new buildings. He liked the old San Francisco, but it took a certain perception to look beyond some of the grit and see the humanity of the people. And that's what Herb Caen was really specialized in. He always saw the humanity of the people. He was very critical of what we call modernization, which this drive that began after World War II, which said, we have to become a modern city. And a lot of wreckage occurred. We destroyed the Fox Theater, the city of Paris, and Union Square. Herb Caen was always ahead of his time in recognizing the importance of historic preservation of our architectural gems, and routinely fought and used his column to fight to save the city's great architecture. He was successful in building a recognition that old San Francisco was at risk and needed to be preserved. So I would say that was big picture. Was, okay, we lost City of Paris. People realized that was a catastrophe, that never should have the Fox Theater. he reminded people like, hey, you know what? While you're not paying attention, people are coming in here and destroying our legacy buildings, and be alert. The Tenderloin is still pretty much what it looked like in the 1930s. The buildings are pretty much the same, very few demolitions across the whole 31 block area. If you look at buildings, you know, along Eddy Street, the whole stretch of Eddy Street between Hyde and Mason, where it's all old buildings, and you have all the single room occupancy hotels, the SROs, the great Cadillac Hotel, which houses a museum, the former Herald Hotel, now Herald Apartments, and the Ambassador Hotel. These are majestic buildings that, you know, had people not awakened to the need to preserve them, might not be here today. And I think Herb was part of that consciousness. He also was very sympathetic to SROs, which at a time when they were very disfavored in the city. And so he was a great ally on that, and particularly conscious. He'd write about the seniors being potentially evicted, and he would side, of course, with the seniors. So he was very sympathetic for the old timers living in these SROs. A single room occupancy hotel, which are very common in the Tenderloin, and we have 20,000 units in San Francisco. It's the major housing stock for low-income single adults, where many of the rooms have no private bathroom and none have a private kitchen. Through the 50s, there really wasn't a stigma of SROs. It was working people. Women lived there, were living independent women. For Herb Caen, that was the SRO population of, like, you know, truck drivers, longshore folks, people, merchant seamen. Those were the kind of blue collar folks he saw as kind of the essence of San Francisco, who he was trying to keep here.
I came to San Francisco in 1980, was running a restaurant in San Francisco, a very popular restaurant, and I remember Herb Caen coming in and somebody saying, oh, that's Herb Caen. Now, I knew who he was, but I had never seen him. So I was very excited, you know, Herb Caen. And of course, being fairly new to San Francisco and not knowing Herb Caen, at the end of the meal, I said, there's no check for the table. And he was furious, and he said, if you don't bring me a check, I'm not coming back. So I said, right away, sir. And so that was, I learned a lesson about Herb Caen really quickly. And you never took him for granted, but you never tried to play to him too hard. And that was one of his great qualities, I think, is he was everyman, and then he was royalty. If you slipped a Herb's Vitamin V, which was his drink, which was Stolichnaya in a wine glass with crushed ice and an orange peel, if you slipped that to him and forgot to put it on the bill, no harm, no foul. But you never really had to treat Herb like he was somebody special, even though he knew it and we knew it. We opened Bix in 1988. And it was very busy from the beginning, and Herb and his pals and a lot of people in his social circle, as well as a lot of the movers and shakers of San Francisco, immediately became customers. He was really kind of a bon vivant, you know. I mean, in the truest sense of the word, he moved around the city with a lot of speed, and he got into a lot of places, went to a lot of places. You were always hoping for a mention from him, and we did get a mention one time. We were in his annual Christmas poem, which was, I thought, for a boy from Peoria, Illinois, I had died and gone to heaven to have my restaurant mentioned. But the thing I remember most about him, even though I knew him and from these other experiences in other restaurants, was when he came here. He used to come with a great character named Max Arnold, who was an old ad man. And Max and he would come and have lunch. And Herb always wore a hat. I wouldn't say 100% of the time, but he was a man that wore a hat. And so when he came in one afternoon for lunch, I took his hat and put it up in our coat room on the shelf that we put hats in, and I put it the right way, which is the crown down. You're never supposed to put a hat brim down. So I put it with the crown side down, and Herb gave me one of these you know what you're doing kind of looks. And again, I just thought, okay, I've arrived in San Francisco. I actually put Herb Caen's hat away. So it was, you know, he was the best friend a restaurateur could ever have.
He was interested in everything. You know, there aren't many people like that. You know, he didn't talk about himself much. That's another thing too. I mean, you can't really be picking up information about everything else if you're always talking about yourself. And that's one of the things that made him really fun to be with. I mean, he really was interested in what was going on and what people had to say about various things.
His column was tremendous, and particularly from, say, my point of view of architecture and city planning and all that sort of thing. That I remember we were in our neighborhood group here, which he was in the same neighborhood down the street there. We were battling the explosion of high-rise, which sort of seems ironic now because they're all over the place. And we were struggling and struggling, and all it took was, after all these meetings and everything, be one word from Herb, and it was all over. But he always had really good, I thought, good instincts about the city. And it's hard to really figure how powerful he was for his political thoughts. And he was very ethical, and he also took very good care of his friends. He did. And he took great care of me. We were doing a very controversial thing on the waterfront called Pier 39, and he just went one item in there once and said that I was doing it and it seemed like a good idea and it should be done, and that was it. After.
Yeah, I had a gallery during all those years, or most of them, and if he made, you know, every now and then I'd ask him if he'd stick some kind of plug in. He does, not all the time, but just occasionally. And if he'd said a word, I mean, you know, people would come charging in until the show was over.
His influence is its absence. I mean, more often than not, he says, God, you know, some problem around here. I wish they wouldn't do that if Herb was here. And,
or wouldn't Herb have loved that?
Well, that's true too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's also, you know, that some of the shenanigans that the city fathers go through. You know, boy, if Herb was here, that would never happen.
One of the really a huge controversy and a very defining political moment that's largely forgotten now was the execution of someone called Carol Chessman, who was executed in San Quentin, very controversially. There was great controversy about his guilt, and it became a real flashpoint, not only about his guilt, but about the death penalty and just opposition to the death penalty. And Herb Caen was opposed to the death penalty. He was opposed to the execution of Carol Chessman, and actually went up and picketed outside San Quentin when Chessman was executed. And then he wrote an incredibly powerful column about it. And he said, well, hey, if we really believe, as we say, that the death penalty is a deterrent and it shows the majesty of the law and all of its functioning, and this is what we should do to deter crime and to show evildoers this is what happens, then why is it that we hide this away in this dark little dungeon of a room where we let a few observers in and it's hidden away, as if this great majesty of the law is a dark and hidden thing, then an ugly thing that has to be hidden away. And then he ended it saying, and a dark and ugly thing it is. And that spoke to another aspect of Caen that gave him this remarkably well-rounded quality, was that he was a very astute and pointed political commentator, and he was not afraid to speak his mind in his column. He was a very eloquent spokesman for what you might call San Francisco values. And another thing that he did that took some guts to do was right after Pearl Harbor, he stuck up for Japanese Americans, and there was just enormous hatred and bigotry. And right after Pearl Harbor, white San Franciscans actually drove through Japantown creepily, just staring at the Japanese Americans, the Nisei mostly, in Japantown. And Herb Caen actually said, hey, these people are, law-abiding American citizens, and he called for an end to that kind of bigotry. And unfortunately, of course, it wasn't enough to prevent in the mass internment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. But he was he stood up for them, which was greatly to his credit, and it was not a popular political move.
Herb, as you know, referred to himself as the Sacramento Kid because he himself had been an outsider. He was a little Jewish kid from Sacramento who had come to San Francisco and felt the wonder of it and was kind of seduced by it. That is the story of San Francisco, really, outsiders who come in and are taken with its charms. And he somehow, in the column, made everybody feel as if they were part of that process. A lot of us were there. As a gay man moving to the city in the early 70s, I felt I had a friend in Herb Caen, even though I knew he was certifiably straight. He seemed to embrace everything that was there. He talked about Polk Street, which was the gay district at the time. He called it Polkstrasse. I remember him having an item that said, Harvey Milk is running on the homo ticket, and I don't mean milk. Now, that's not him being homophobic. That was a joke about the fact that there was actually a milk here called homo milk for homogenized. When Herb had it in there, you had the feeling that no one was being judged, and this was all part of the wonderful, wacky fun of being in the city. And I remember being so proud if I was at a party and he was there, by the time he knew who I was, that he would say, "Hi, Armistead." And then eventually, when I started to write my own serial fiction in the Chronicle, I had a desk right outside his office, and I could hear the royal typewriter that he insisted on using clattering away inside. It was straight out of the front page or something, It was a real old-timey thing. I think when I started writing Tales of the City, I began to think about all the elements that made his column charming was that he covered everybody. He hung out with socialites. He probably liked it a little bit more than I ever did. But there was always the mix. It was the people that, the variety of the town that excited him. And it was really thrilling when I started actually being in the newspaper with him every day. Not, as people often remember, in the back of his section, basically. And how can I say this modestly? He was a little bit jealous that he'd been king of the world forever in that newspaper. And there were people actually saying, "I read you before Herb Caen now." He may have heard that himself. I don't know. That's the greatest compliment in the world. But he referred to me one day in his column as a part-time writer and a full-time personality, because I didn't have to write every single day. I would write for 6 or 7 month blocks, 5 days a week, but had not been doing it for 50 years. And I realized he was just a tiny bit resentful that there was another way to do this, but he never would have given up the chance to talk to the city every morning, not in a million years, and he didn't as long as he lived. When I was writing about Rock Hudson in Tales of the City, I used blanks in the old Victorian convention because I didn't want to name him. Well, Herb wanted to get one up on me and said, well, his name is something like Brick Oldcar. He did the same thing one time when I wrote a column in which some local socialite young women were talking about how the husband was not paying her any attention, and the other one said, "Oh, well, you should get a Samoan. They're wonderful." And of course, being deliberately crass by making these socialites be mildly racist. And the other one says, "Oh, I don't want a dog." And she said, "Not a Samoyed, a Samoan." And Herb knew who I was talking about. And he wrote a column in which he told the same kind of story, only everybody thought everything that Herb said was real. And two very formidable members of the Samoan community showed up in Herb's office one morning wanting an apology because they felt that he was being racist about Samoans. I had gotten away with it because it was some frivolous ladies in a work of fiction. He didn't, and he had to do an apology in the column. And it showed me then what the difference is between having fiction to hide behind and actually having people say every morning, well, Herb Caen said this.
Herb was very progressive. So as the city changed, he was right there, and he was writing about it, and he was capturing it. And I think in time, he became such a part of the city, such a part of the fabric, that sort of he felt he had an obligation to the people, and people were turning to him for, make sense of this, Herb.
And of course, we went through so many terrible tragedies when I first started during the 70s, and just after I first started there, Vietnam, and we had just come off the sort of hippie generation now into the war generation, and Nixon and Watergate, and then the SLA and Patty Hearst, and then down to Jim Jones and Jonestown, and the mayor Moscone being assassinated, and Darby Milk. And there were some extraordinary times with mind-boggling sort of.
He was not afraid to exert his opinion. You know, there are columnists who don't want to really be opinionated and deal with the backlash from readers. But if Herb felt like somebody should be elected mayor, he was going to say it. If he felt that, you know, this was a bad idea to be building this building, that it was an eyesore, he was going to say it.
It's tough to put it into one or two sentences because just I always thought of it as being pretty much not all things to all people, but certainly well worth the read.
His coat, I think, was symbolic because you know that when he would come in and take it off, and you'd always know when he put it back on, it meant that it was lunchtime or that he had somewhere to be. But he dressed very well, had many hats. He even had a special hat for when he did his column. It was a little baseball cap with a little propeller on the top, and that was his riding hat. And it was very goofy. And every once in a while, he would come out mid-column and walk down the hall to get a cup of coffee. And I think he forgot he had it on. And I think some of the people at the paper would be like, what is going on? But that was his riding hat.
You know, green is my color. I know I'll tell you. So I go immediately right into this range here. I love these. As far as Herb's clothes, he was a very, as he was with everything, he was very knowledgeable. I always wondered, in all the years that I knew Herb, where all of his vast knowledge came from, because he was so knowledgeable on such a wide array of subjects. For a kid that grew up in Sacramento, California, it was always amazing to me that he knew opera and ballet, he knew music, he knew art, and he definitely knew his clothes. He knew what worked for him. He bowed to a small degree as far as what was currently going on in fashion. But if fashion changed in a way that he didn't think was appropriate, he was very quick to express his thoughts. Currently, as you may or may not know, in men's clothes today are much closer fitting to the body. The button stance is high, much higher. That means the jacket buttons higher, which lifts everything up. And this happened, there was a start of that trend back in the 70s. And Brioni, who is one of our top vendors along with Keaton, raised the button stance. And Herb came in and he said, what is this? This is not the way a man is built. His waist is here. The whole look of the garment has a balance, and you're ruining it when you raise the button stance. It's just not right. So he did not buy into that. Not only did Herb have a very good concept of what worked for him, for his lifestyle, for his build, but he had a fairly strong opinion on how other people ought to look as well. So it was not above and beyond Herb to make a comment if he thought someone was too anxious to buy into current trends when they weren't appropriate for the individual he was speaking of, age-wise, whatever. So he was very sure of himself on looks. He was very sure of himself on many things and well-educated. And as I said, it just always amazed me. So he was a delight to be around for many reasons, of course, but one of them was that he was always exploring new things. He knew a lot, but he always wanted to know more. So he traveled extensively and was a great traveler as far as learning things from his traveling. And he was just he was for sure a Renaissance man. There's no question. When you asked me to describe Herb, he was truly a Renaissance man. We have been going to La Centrale for 40 years. It opened 40 years ago. And we went there starting 40 years ago. And early on it was Herb Caen and Willie Brown and myself. And we went there because we love the flavor of it. We love the authenticity of it. And over the years, 2 or 3 more people joined our Friday lunch group. We do eat there other days too. I eat there almost every day. But Fridays for 40 years is our day at La Centrale. It really has, first of all, the food is very good. The atmosphere is authentic and very warm. The people that own it and operate it and the staff are terrific. So somewhere along the line back many, many years ago, it became a club. It became a club for us. And it's a club for a number of people, so we all see each other. And obviously it's close proximity. For me at least, Herb always complained that it wasn't close for him, and he had to walk a long way to get there. He particularly complained because we played dice for the check, and then we played dice for a little money after that. And Herb wasn't a good loser. You know, he said, you know, show me a good loser and I'll show you a fairly stupid man. So basically, he did not like to lose at dice. And when he did lose, for some reason, he always started picking on me. He would start out saying, you know, we've been eating here for 15 years. It's simple for you. I have to leave the Chronicle building. I have to walk through the Emporium. I have to walk up Powell Street. I have to walk through Union Square. And then I have to walk down Sutter Street to get to have lunch with you. You walk out the door and you're there. And he says, sometimes the weather's bad. It's raining. And for you, I have to go that distance. That never came up when he won. But as soon as he might lose the lunch check or something, I knew I was in for it. The thing about Herb Caen, and everybody has their Herb Caen stories, because he wrote for 55 years, and there was and isn't anybody like him. There wasn't then, and there isn't now. What he wrote about every day, he wrote about all of us. He wrote about the beauty of the city. He wrote about the culture of the city, our symphony, our opera, our theater. And through reading Herb Caen, he gave a heartbeat to the city. And one of the ways that I recognize that personally is that the city isn't much bigger today than it was when Herb Caen died. We're still under 1 million people, less than 1 million people in San Francisco proper. But all of a sudden it seems like a big city. It doesn't have the small town flavor, the best things about a small town that it had when Herb was alive. And it's because he kind of brought us all together. He brought us together in spirit. He brought us together so we knew each other, even sometimes you didn't know the person. But if you read about him often enough in Herb Caen's column, all of a sudden you felt like you did know him. And that bringing the city together, giving it a heartbeat, emphasizing its uniqueness, its beauty, its specialness, without him doing that, all of a sudden the city starts to feel a little bit more like a lot of other cities.
In many ways, the 40s and the 50s were kind of the era of San Francisco that you associate the most with him. This is the era of the big-nosed convertibles and starlets and martini glasses and, you know, the big hotels and sort of the glamour with the fog pouring in and the cable cars and powerful, sexy people, you know, engaged in, you know, great behind-the-scene things that he's going to reveal to you. But as the 60s hit, when the beatniks came in the late 50s, then the hippies came in, unlike many newspapermen who were getting middle-aged, who would have been just kind of, you know, really irritated and, oh God, what's happening in my beloved town, he actually welcomed. He was a true liberal. So that's another reason that he was the emblematic newspaperman of San Francisco. He was just a staunch American liberal, and he believed in tolerance above everything else, and he believed in keeping an open mind, so that even though he laughed at the foibles, he was the one, I think, that coined the expression beatniks after the Russian Sputniks, and it was done in part to sort of take the piss out of them, you know. It's like, and he recognized the poser quality, the inflated, the silliness, the pomposity, the incoherence of all these kind of social movements. It wasn't like he was just, oh my God, the Beats are so awesome and, you know, we must bow down before them. No, he made fun of them, but he welcomed the, you know, the energy, the transgressiveness. He accepted them as another flavor in the tapestry of San Francisco, which has always been a maverick town. It's a town that welcomes change and that welcomes kind of revolutionaries.
Herb Caen was introduced to me when I decided to seek public office. And he was introduced to me by a friend of his, a fellow tennis player, Marion Conrad. They played tennis at least once or twice a week at the Kell Club. And she was a great tennis player, and he considered himself a great tennis player. But she knew that for a young guy trying to start out in the world of politics in San Francisco in the 60s, nothing would be more important than to have a mention in Herb Caen's column. And she introduced me to Herb Caen at a lunch. And before the lunch was over, Herb Caen had dismissed her, and the two of us had started to develop a friendship that lasted till the date of his death. Herb Caen was incredibly bright. Herb Caen was extremely well-read. Herb Caen was incredibly connected and informed. And believe me, that was not lost on me. I think he thought I had similar kind of connections someplace, or he thought that I was so into life. Let me tell you how it really blossomed. I was introduced to him at Bardelli's. About 3 or 4 weeks later, I was at Bardelli's with a buddy of mine named John Dearman, who ultimately became a judge and my law partner, and a good-looking woman that I had met on an airplane. In those days, you meet a stewardess, you might invite her if she was staying overnight in the city to hang out. Well, this was a gorgeous stewardess, and I took her to Bardelli's. But I was married, so I had to make sure that things didn't get out of hand, PR-wise. And so I went to Bardelli's, and I had this woman with me, and I had John Dearman with me, and Herb was there having lunch with some other people. He sent a note over, which one is the beard? Asking, which one of you are the beard? Asking me if I'm beard or John is beard. And I sent the note back to him saying, don't be so conventional. She's the beard. he put that in the column. And he started quoting me, and sometimes he would attribute quotes to me that he wanted to get in the column, but they had to come from somebody. And so I became literally identified as a quotable person simply because Caen helped make me there. So you ask, what was the relationship based on? It was based on a joy for life and a method by which each of us could do whatever we wanted to do. The great interest that we had in food and locations and music and all the other things that we were about, including sports. And I got to tell you, as an aside on that, we actually went to 49er football games together on the public transportation bus. We would come down to Civic Center, get on Muni, ride out to the ballpark, watch the games. We had the season tickets for the football games. We were great football fans, not basketball fans. We were great football fans, and we hung out together in every aspect. In that process, we always wanted to make sure we were well attired, we were well dressed. At many occasions, we discuss what can be worn, should be worn, and who should wear it, period. We never really wanted to be other than extremely presentable on all occasions. And so our relationship with Wilkes, in part, was triggered by our incredible quest to be well-dressed. The problem with Wilkes, though, is that he never understood family discount. You could never get anything out of him other than full price. And the most amazing thing is that was important to Herb Caen. It was important to Herb Caen because as a columnist, he never wanted anybody to conclude that his comments about restaurants, about friends, about clothing had anything to do with something somebody had given him. I have been with Herb Caen when he would walk out of a restaurant and never come back if they wouldn't give him a bill. He insisted upon paying, which was amazing for me. And if you said, did I learn anything from Herb Caen? Yeah, I learned not to go with him if I didn't want to pay. Herb Caen was an incredible person committed to equality in the common man. Herb Caen had great respect for the labor movement. Herb Caen, as a columnist, above and beyond whatever the employment compensations rates were with the paper, if the regular employees went out, Herb was with them. He was not with management. Herb also had a commitment on the equality side to never play in one paper against the other. He switched papers a couple of times, but it had to do more with the flexibility of his journalistic attitude and his journalistic respect. He was anti-war, really incredibly anti-war. He was literally into equal rights for everybody, and he was very careful to make sure that was the reality of his column and of his personal expressions and of his personal conduct. Herb was unique as a writer. His columns were like the daily history of the things in this city and the things that were reflected from throughout the world that might affect this city, including the people. Anybody reading Herb Caen's columns or Herb Caen's writings would find it more interesting than some of the so-called accounts of how San Francisco developed in many of the books. Herb's columns are the living spirit of what this city was all about on a daily basis. And it's amazing how relevant they are today as they were when he wrote them 60 years ago. Herb was an incredible journalist. I believe he got the Pulitzer Prize on journalism because he really was so respected by people in that particular world. His commitment to accuracy, his commitment to objectivity, and his commitment to appropriate apology for any mistake. He didn't apologize the way many journalists do in this day and age. Many publications come back with a refined version of their previous misrepresentation. Not Herb Caen. If he made a misrepresentation, he up front identified it and said how stupid it was that he had in fact engaged in that conduct. His standard of journalism was magical. And if anybody ever asked me, what did you really learn from Herb Caen? A standard of journalism that I tried to translate into my political world, which may very well have been what saved me all these years.
Herb is one of the maybe 2 or 3 people I've known who actually got to have their funeral before they died. There was this thing called Herb Caen Day, when the whole city knew that he had cancer. He knew he was checking out. He consented to this event. I remember standing with him there on the waterfront, watching. There were biplanes flying over the reviewing stand. I was sitting next to Don Johnson, the actor, and Willie Mays, the baseball player, and Joel Grey was singing Cabaret. There were bike messengers, people that Herb had championed, who were riding past in review. And Herb leaned over to me and said, and the thing is, they're doing this for a writer,
I can't wait to read the Chronicle tomorrow morning to find out what happened here today. I've been sitting behind some character in a brown hat and haven't been able to see a thing. Herb and I met 53 years ago in London in World War II. And I'd like to take you through our 53 years together, year by year. It's been a wonderful friendship. It's been one that has known absolutely no bounds, it seems to me, of affection for one another. And I'm grateful for those wonderful years. We had some great times together. You know, a celebration for Herb Caen here on the banks of the bay which graces the city that he once called Baghdad. It seems incredible. San Francisco, of course, didn't need Herb Caen to bring it fame, but he put a frame around its gorgeous, glorious image. Those who came to see the picture stayed to admire the frame that enhanced it. Herb Caen has not spared San Francisco his love, as you know, nor has he hidden his occasional disappointment, occasionally his anger in the way she was treated by those he felt defiled her beauty or abused her character. You know, we fellow journalists who love both San Francisco and Herb Caen might whisper among ourselves that there's something uncomfortable about this premier newspaperman's association with his city. To love San Francisco is certainly understandable. In fact, it's almost inevitable. But to have San Francisco love you as San Francisco loves Herb Caen, this columnist, Herb Caen, borders on the unlikely, on the truly incredible. But I shall go forth from this place to testify that I've seen it with my very own eyes, this permanent recognition of Herb Caen's contribution to his city and this great manifestation of a requited love. Herb, step up here.
Me?
one day if I do go to heaven, I'm going to do what every San Franciscan does that goes to heaven. He looks around and says, it ain't bad, but it ain't San Francisco.